listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Good morning, Overwatch League fans. This is your Overwatch League daily episode for February 15th, 2018. Today I'm joined by Overwatch writer and analyst for Winston's Lab, Yiska, to discuss the big trades that we've been having going on in the Overwatch League. But we also did get some Overwatch League news today, and that's around schedule changes. So starting with Stage 2, we will begin to see the stage finals, first and foremost. They'll be moved to Sundays at 1 p.m. PST, so that way we don't have 12 hours worth of matches like we did last time. And then all weekday matches, so the Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday matches, now start at 4 p.m. PST, and then the Saturday matches start at 1 p.m. PST. So that'll be consistent throughout the entire stage, starting at the beginning of Stage 2, which is February 21st. But that's it. Today I sat down with Yiska. We discussed some of the trades going on and movements in Overwatch League, so stay tuned. So there's been a surprising amount of movements going from Stage 1 to Stage 2 of the inaugural season of Overwatch League. But first and foremost, let's talk about the Shanghai Dragons. We'll start at the bottom and work our way up. So Shanghai, they needed and probably got the most help. What should we know about these players that they've signed?
So the first thing we need to know about these 4 new recruits is that they are 3 Koreans and 1 Chinese. And that is obviously already pretty interesting because there will certainly be language barrier issues. It's also the case that these 3 Korean players have never played with each other on a team before. So it's not like you're bringing in a core unit of a successful Korean lineup. That's mostly just players from different teams. And they weren't even necessarily standout talent on their specific rosters. Now, since they've played, obviously a lot of time has passed. So it's very difficult to judge them on the performance they had on their old teams.
So I think you highlighted the high-level overview of what Shanghai is doing. It's kind of unorthodox, and I think you've made the point of that. But what about, let's talk about the individual players. What should we know about Fearless?
He was the main tank for Element Mystic, a rather new team that came in Apex Challenger, and they had a pretty, I would say, convincing performance, and especially also in the Nexus Cup, showed some very good games. Fearless seemed to be a very serviceable Winston player, hasn't played actually too much other main tanks. Interestingly, his second most played character at the moment is Tracer, so that's kind of interesting. But for a good 80% of the time, he has played Winston, and will probably push Roshan out of his starting position, because one thing I would have to say about any of these new recruits is that they should individually probably be starting talent for their respective people they are competing against on their starting rosters for the Shanghai Dragons. So, Fearless doesn't seem to be overall too aggressive. He's also rather rookie-ish, once again, as I said, in the Challenger series. He hasn't actually played any Apex series so far. So, it's not like you're bringing in a very experienced player. Same is true for Addo, who previously played for MVP Space, but even there he was on the roster, but he didn't get much playtime next to Yaki and One Fact. He's mostly known for his Genji and Tracer, but especially his Genji looked really convincing so far, and he might be one of those underrated talents where you could maybe make something out of him. Now, obviously, with Undead also in the roster, who's probably been the strongest performer so far for the Shanghai Dragons, that could become a rather decent DPS line. If you're going to the third recruit, that's Gregory, She's been formerly playing for the Rocks Orcas, has been an off-tank player. Most people think of her as Zarya because she was in a controversy where certain players thought she was cheating because the tracking was too good or something like this. And she was also fairly high ranked on the ladder. Now, this is obviously still true. She's one of the most highly ranked tanks in the league. And she's rather been known recently, and especially on Rocks Orcas, for her diva, because flex tanks naturally in this meta and for a while had to play diva for the most part. Now, the recruitment of Gary opens up some questions because as the fourth recruit I will mention later, there would have potentially been one agent with Late Young from the Miraculous Youngsters roster, the most successful Chinese roster, that you would have thought would have taken a slot on the Chinese team. Now, I think what's happening here is that Late Young was one probably of the best performers in terms of the off-tank role in 2017. It's kind of likely that a team had a bigger pocket or presented him with more opportunities or also more success, so he didn't end up joining the Shanghai Dragons. So Gregory, a pretty good second option here. And then, as I mentioned, the fourth recruit is actually the only veteran, and also the only one that had real success in the past. So Sky, formerly known as Su Fan Jun, is an absolute veteran, even with his very young years. I think I did research a while ago on him, and I think he just recently turned 18. Now, the interesting thing with Su Fan Jun is that he's a flex support, but he also, in my research, turned out to be one of the more vocal players. And as an admirer of the gameplay Miraculous Youngsters showed, it always seemed to me that this narrative of overly aggressive Chinese esports teams, maybe also from other esports, never made sense for Miraculous Youngsters. They were actually quite defensive, very methodical in their play, always had very, very clean front and back lines, and they would take you step by step and would rarely just rush you, but they also had some of these cheesy comms where they could just completely throw you off and take certain points just by their inventions. So if he was to be one of the members that comes up with these concepts, this could be very good for Shanghai.
So I'm glad you mentioned Sky. In your opinion, what is his individual play style like? What type of play style is he going to bring to the Dragons?
In terms of individual play, I have to say he was probably the fourth best, I would say, on the Miraculous Youngsters. So he wasn't necessarily an absolutely sick individual talent. There are other Chinese players in that league. Problem is that most of these are actually underage. Some of them are just 16. So Su Fan Jun, if you want a Chinese flex support that can lead the game, is probably your best bet, and definitely deserves his spot when we're talking about the best Chinese players.
So I think the big question on everybody's mind with these Shanghai signings are, how much better is this team going to be? And obviously, I'm asking you to speculate about a lot, but I would love to hear your thoughts about how far, if at all, do you think that these signings raise up Shanghai in the standings?
So the problem is that this is mostly a relative question, isn't it? So it's not just like Shanghai is improving, but arguably from the hires we have seen so far, other teams have been improving even more, especially the worst teams, with Florida Mayhem getting Sire Player and Awesome Guy, and obviously LA Gladiators getting Fissure, and then Dallas Fuel getting Rascal. These are definitely higher tier picks and recruitments than what Shanghai ended up getting. Arguably, if we want to give a lot of intangible power to Su Fan Jun, he could be on the level, just going from the historical argument of what we've seen of these players so far. Another thing is that, yes, they will probably improve, but the problem is, as I sort of hinted at in the answer of the first question, is that they actually haven't been playing with each other. So you have 4 new recruits that should by all means start over the current players. So you're once again, in terms of team synergy, starting from 0. This is an investment in the future. The problem is, if you still are developing and trying to get somewhere, in the end of stage 2, you probably aren't going to be a playoff contender, are you? So what I think will happen, and yes, this counts as an improvement, is that this team will become better as a result of these recruitments, will maybe have a dip in their performance, so they will start out worse than they were in the very end, where they could have taken a game of both Dallas and Philadelphia. But then they will have a higher probability of upsets against at least mid-tier teams. And like it is with probabilities, they will eventually get 1 or 2 of these series. So they will have upset potential. And they will ultimately also, going into stage 4 and 3 and 4, will probably increase in upset potential. Now, do I think these players are what they needed to get out of the bottom of the league? I don't think so. Like, okay, it's very hard to predict what the meta can do to certain teams, but even in that regard, I don't think they have necessarily recruited meta-resistant players. Someone like a Fearless has only mostly played Winston. Someone like an Ado has mostly been known for his Genji and Tracer. Though, to be fair, these are very meta-resistant characters. Gregory, yes, she will probably start almost always. And Sufan Jun, yes, okay, that is true. But 2 of your top talents that you now recruited might be rendered rather maybe suboptimal in terms of if a quad tank meta was to come around, depending on what is actually played. So it's also quite possible that the meta falls into their favor, and that's again a relative argument where certain teams can't cope with the meta. But even a team like the Dallas Fuel that currently had probably the weakest meta they could have conceived of, they still managed to win more games than Shanghai Dragons. So even their lowest low is still better than the Shanghai Dragons that we can expect. So overall, yes, this is definitely an improvement if you compare it to the old Shanghai Dragons. Will it raise them in the standings? I would predict no.
Well, the Dallas Fuel are an excellent segue because this is the other team that we're going to be discussing today. And really what I want to talk about is the current strategy that we're seeing right now from their signings. We've got more DPS that we know what to do with. Dallas, at the end of this, will have 5 DPS players. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I think it is a problem. Because we've already heard from other Overwatch League players that sitting on the bench for them is actually not desirable. So in order to get into the Overwatch League, you already need to be a player that has immense drive, that wants to win, that wants to sell, that wants to play. We've heard that from Numlocked. We heard a little bit of that from XQC. And the fact that Fissure and Rascal go away from currently the Stage 1 winner and second in the standings, London Spitfire, suggests to me that they also don't want to just freeload and get these achievements by never or very rarely playing. So I think it is in the mentality of the Overwatch League player to contribute towards the victories of his team. Now, 5 DPS players is a bit of a problem because even in this meta, we saw most teams field 3 DPS players most of the time, so they would rotate depending on the map, what kind of a hero was needed. So you would have, for instance, bring in Pharah specialists, and some teams even rotated less. So, for instance, a Philadelphia would very rarely switch their DPS, obviously because the DPS is basically with Shadow Baron and Carpi is basically the best thing about their team. Now, 5 DPS players also in a tank-heavy meta is certainly also problematic. Now, DPS is a stretchable label because, for instance, I think there's a lot of overlap, and arguably because DPS seems to be one of the more mechanically demanding positions, it's probably also easier to then transition into other roles. And also, if I had to guess, just sheer talent, the amount of sheer talent that we have on the DPS role on average is higher than on the other roles. So skill transition is definitely high in these players. Now, if you're talking specifically about Dallas Fuel, so they have 5 DPS players. Obviously, these will have to switch to flex tanks, and depending on what the meta is, even would have to go on Winston or whatever. Or maybe we will see 2 main tanks start for Dallas or whatever. But yes, that is a problem for Dallas. So you want to keep everyone happy. And I think in order to do that, you need to transition certain people. So I think what will happen is that even if we don't end up in a triple tank meta, that at least one of these DPS players is permanently going to switch to the flex role. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because currently, what actually happens to Dallas if Mickey gets sick? Well, it hasn't happened before, at least not to the point where Mickey couldn't necessarily start. But if a diva was required on Dallas, that was only really in the ballpark of Mickey. They only ever switched out Mickey when they were playing Roadhog, even though Mickey played a serviceable Roadhog. But currently, statistically from the Wences Lab website, actually the best character that Dallas Fuel currently has is Taimu in Roadhog. He's nuts on that hero. So you've sort of solved your 1 DPS issue there. I think if Roadhog is stable, you start Taimu every single time. Now, if it actually isn't, it gets problematic because supposedly much of the shot calling is done by players like Taimu. And if Seagal is in the roster, he also is asked to do certain calls. Now, how do you reconcile that if you want to start Effect and Rascal? These players obviously don't have super good English. Even Effect, after playing so long. Rascal also, I would assume, had English classes because of his time in London, but definitely won't be absolutely fluent. So I've also not heard that he's a shot caller in that regard. So I think we're missing important puzzle pieces here for Dallas. I think what is happening is that we're seeing an incomplete picture. I think what we will see is that one of these DPS players is going to transition to the flex tank role, and that could be Taimu, that could be Seagal, or what we might be seeing is maybe that someone will be traded, or that the roster will be further extended. So I think they still have 1 player slot to sign. There's obviously trades. That could happen. So I think currently, also in terms of the hero pools of these 5 DPS players, it's actually a really challenging puzzle to make out what's going to happen. Because you obviously have 2 new DPS players with IKM and Rascal coming in. Rascal mostly known for his projectile DPS, just as Seagal. So again, he's probably completely covering Seagal's champion pool in terms of what we've seen so far of Seagal. What he's capable of. I mean, even his Reaper was pretty serviceable, you gotta say, in the last match. In terms of AKM, if Soldier was to become meta, that would be kind of interesting. I think he should be the starter for that. Even though you still have Harry Hook, obviously. So, you're talking maybe then even about 5.5 DPS players there. Because you ideally, or you could actually, like, if Soldier was the meta, you could say, okay, Custer, Chips, you guys start, also because we're playing something crazy like Ana Moira on defense, and then we're putting Harry on Soldier because he probably previously would have been the best Soldier on that team. Now there's AKM, and AKM himself has a weird champion pool for a DPS player. So he covers the hit scan, but not the tracer. He mostly plays McCree and Soldier. We haven't seen too much Widow of him. But then he also can play a top-level Pharah, which we've seen at the World Cup. So he's very strange in his map pool. It's also very interesting to me that he mentioned he wanted to play Genji. I can only imagine that this happened before they ever heard about Rascal, because I don't think you would otherwise make AKM do that. And if AKM was easily capable of becoming a top-tier Genji, he should have probably done that in Rogue already, because they definitely needed someone else than Nico to play the Genji role, because back then Diva and Genji should have been at the same time. So my question then is, if AKM was inherently capable of doing that, why didn't he do that already? And then you have Taimu, who plays, or tried to play at least, basically every DPS hero under the sun, but you probably want him to focus on the flick aim DPS, like a McCree, like a Widowmaker, and obviously then he can also play the off-tank, especially Roadhog. So he seems to be very good at these one-shot, high-impact characters, and that's also true, for instance, for Hook. And yeah, then there's Seagal, and he seems to be mostly pressured by these new recruitments, even though he had a pretty solid impact on Pharah and Genji. And though his Pharah was actually looked like a top 5 Pharah in the league for the hour he has played it, his Genji was very up and down. So he had pretty solid blade usage, but then sometimes weird mistakes would happen. And admittedly, we have seen 20 minutes of play from him, but for me it was very up and down, even though there's a lot of variance. Now, Rascal comes in, and he's probably going to take that spot from him. So, if you were to ask me what was going to happen to either Taimu or Seagal, I think they are the most likely to switch into that off-tank position, or one of them might actually be traded. Now, if Taimu was to be traded, it feels like a little bit of the soul of Dallas Fuel would be gone. Seagal, I think, would be probably one of the players that best handles the bench, also because he has the streaming. But at the same time, let's not forget he's leaving a lot of money on the table in order to play Overwatch League. He could just be full-time streaming, and would definitely make more money than just playing for Dallas. So, yeah, this is as far as it goes. I think we will see further announcements from Dallas, and I actually expect some crazy things to come from them.
Yiska is a guy I don't want to interrupt. If I'm being honest, everything he says is just so thoughtful. I can't thank him enough for coming on this show. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at YiskaOut, and make sure to check him out. He's everywhere. He's doing oversight with Thorne and Monty as a guest sometimes. He's writing articles for Winston's Lab. He's everywhere, so make sure to follow him. He's definitely one of the people you want to follow in Overwatch League. I'm going to be joined by him again tomorrow, and we're going to discuss about the rest of the trades and movements going on in Overwatch League. If you like the show, make sure to follow, subscribe, whatever, leave a 5-star review. We thank you for all of your support. You can listen to the show everywhere online, including the front page of winstonslab.com. Find our website, overwatchleaguedaily.com, or send me an email at overwatchleaguedaily@gmail.com. That's going to do it for today. I'll be back tomorrow with Yiska for another episode of Overwatch League Daily.